Frank is leading us.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Frank Petrie with the law firm of Kotchett, Petrie, and McCarthy. I want to thank everybody for coming today. We've gathered together to announce the legal steps that have been taken today by the family of a 24-year-old woman, Samia Stumo, who was killed in the crash of the Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft about 3.5 weeks ago. Today, we'd like to get you to know a little bit about Samia and the legal steps her family are taking. This morning, you will first hear from Samia's father, Michael Stumo, her mother, Nadia Milleran, and brother, Adnan Stumo, as well as her great-uncle, Ralph Nader, who has been a champion of consumer and product safety for decades. Following their remarks, there will be brief presentations by Kevin Durkin with the Clifford Law Offices and myself to give you a brief overview of the claims that have been asserted against Boeing, against Rosemont, a component part supplier, a sensor, the filing contemporaneously of a tort claim against the FAA and Ethiopian Airlines. But first, we'd like to start with some comments from Samia's father, Michael.
Good morning. My name is Michael Stumo, and I'm Samia Stumo's dad. My wife, Nadia, woke me up early in the morning on March 10th to say that a plane crash had happened in Ethiopia. I did not believe Samia could be on that plane. I could not lose another child. But she was on the plane. I could not breathe. My son tore, paced, and sobbed. We drove 3 hours to New York City to find the earliest airplane to go to Addis. 20 years ago, we lost another child, Nels, to cancer. He was 2. Samia and Nels were best friends. When my wife and I were in hospitals with Nels, Samia was frustrated that she was not being taught how to read, so she taught herself to read. She was 4 years old. After Nels died, we bought a farm and moved to it because life, we discovered, is short. We homeschooled Samia and our 2 sons, Adnan and Tor. We needed to be together. Samia raised pigs at the age of 9, driving a tractor and a stripped-down Jeep across the fields to haul water to them. She eventually went to high school and graduated early. She traveled the world from Peru to Denmark to Tanzania, but despite job opportunities on other continents, she pursued a job in Washington, D.C., and was hired by ThinkWell, a global health nonprofit organization based there. She wanted to be nearer to us and to her grandmother, her grandfather, and her great uncle and great aunt, just in case something happened. Something did happen, but it happened to her. Her new employer sent Samia to Uganda to set up new offices. The Boeing 737 MAX 8 drove itself and fully buried itself in the ground at hundreds of miles per hour, disintegrating into small pieces under the earth. We flew there to bring her home, but we learned there were no survivors. Then we learned we could not bring home her body, or even fragments of her body. I stood on that Ethiopian agricultural field with my family, looking at the crater, feeling her. This should not happen to anyone again. That's why we're here.
Thank you, Michael. We'll now hear from Samia's mother, Nadia.
I'm Samia's mom, and though I'm her elder,
I learned and keep learning so much from my only daughter. We would all want to be like Samia, who was lighthearted. She brushed past negative, inconsequential comments and focused on what is good and what could get done. Samia was a binding force in our family. Among her friends, in her academic departments, she was extraordinary with logistics, getting people together to have good times, eat and dance together, and feel connected. This led to marvelous cooperative projects, both socially and in anthropology and global health. Samia could marshal and analyze data for the benefit of real people in need. She linked technical and human skills. There is a huge hole in our family and among her friends. We struggle to build up our connections as she did so effortlessly and with grace and fun. We are one of 337 families with such huge holes because this aircraft didn't function. Samia and her fellow passengers shouldn't have died. Those in charge of creating and selling this plane did not treat Samia as they would their own daughters. We as passengers need to demand that planes be safe so that no one else dies. Profits should not come before safety, and we are making this effort here to help prevent a third crash.
Thank you, Nadia. Our next speaker is Samia's brother, Adnan.
My sister was my constant companion since she was born. We were homeschooled together, played music together, and competed on the same sports teams throughout our childhoods in New England. We spent countless hours exploring the woods and fields around the farm and inventing fantastical worlds in the barn. Sammy had vivid memories of those childhood years, and we would regularly reminisce as adults. My sister was intensely competitive and never wanted to be the second child in anything but age. As we grew, Sammy outstripped me in many ways. She had so much to teach me about compassion, self-awareness, sensitivity to others, focus, and just straight blithe joyfulness. But what she had to offer the world of global health was even greater. Give Samia the next half-century to apply her intelligence and zeal to the institutional failings of international aid, and the world would be utterly changed. The butterfly effect of the Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 crash is massive. The potential of my sister and 156 others driven straight into the ground because of Boeing's greed. I will keep Samia's influence present in my mind and in my life. I knew her so well, and I can imagine her advice and consolation in the rough times ahead. I feel the most hopeless when I imagine my young cousins and the future children of my brother and myself growing up without Samia's tremendous presence and never even realizing what they've lost.
Thank you, Adnan. Do we have a phone hookup for our next speaker, Ralph Nader? Many of you are well aware of Ralph Nader's career as an advocate for consumers and in particular for product safety. Ironically, his grandniece was taken as a victim of that, and Ralph has a few words that he'd like to share with us. Ralph?
Samia Stuma was extraordinary. It's the kind of leadership we hoped for from the young generation. She had leadership, compassion, and intellectual rigor written all over her. She'd drop anything to help anybody. She had her priorities in global health right down to the community level. And that's where she wanted to work, and we'll never know how many people would have been saved by her work over the next 50 years. But we will know what we all have to do for Samia, those wonderful people in those two planes in Indonesia and Ethiopia, many of them embarking to further their effort to help make the world better. And we know that with this initiative today and other initiatives, that the whole world will be affected. And if we don't get this right, if we don't end the cozy relationship between the Patsy FAA, the captured agency, which had been documented for years, and the Boeing company, 5,000 of these fatally flawed planes will be in the air all over the world with millions of passengers. An aircraft manufacturer, no matter what its past safety record, is not allowed 2 or more free disasters that are due to the engineering misdesign of the Boeing 737 MAX, whose engineers were mercilessly pressured by top Boeing management to speed up in order to compete with the Airbus 320neo, whose engineers were allowed to get those problems right. And so it'll all come out. There's never been 2 air crashes that are incurring more investigations. The U.S. Congress, the National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Justice Department, FBI, criminal probe, the operating grand jury, and other foreign countries that are going to investigate. But in order to make air travel safer, in order to show that there's going to be no more deregulation, meaning death and disaster, and that the government has to be arm's length with the Boeing manufacturer, all airline passengers have to be alert. Consumers have to boycott that plane, the 737 MAX 8. The media has to continue doing its very good job thus far. And above all, here's what we have to move toward. Those planes should never fly again. Those planes, the 737 MAX 8, must be recalled because, as Bloomberg Businessweek pointed out, Boeing executives pushed its engineers to press an aging design beyond its limits. The 737 was designed in the mid-1960s. That plane is not fixable by software that cannot possibly predict all the failed modes that could accompany a plane that's aerodynamically prone to stall, not proof stall. And so we are very cognizant of the 2 law firms who are taking this case, and they are outstanding law firms in the area of aviation safety. And we hope that the tremendous loss of Samia Stumo and all the people in those two flight disasters will lead to a dramatic change in airline safety, so that never again will software take control of a plane against its own pilots, and never again will the Boeing company be able to blame the pilots around the world and in the U.S. should there be any disaster, because it designed a flawed aircraft.
Thank you, Ralph. Our next speaker is Kevin Durkin of the Clifford Law Office, who is going to outline for you the legal steps that were taken today to help accomplish the goals that have been set by the Stumo family. Kevin?
Today, on behalf of the family of Samia, we have filed a complaint in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois here in Chicago. As defendants, we have named the Boeing Company, whose corporate offices are just a couple blocks from here, Ethiopian Airlines and their related entities, and Rosemont Aerospace Incorporated. In addition, we have filed what is known as a federal tort claim today against the Federal Aviation Administration, commonly known as the FAA. Under federal law, you cannot initially file a lawsuit against the FAA. You have to make what's known as a claim against them. We have filed that claim. They have a certain period of time, 6 months, to either accept the claim or reject the claim. And until that time frame is done, we cannot file the suit against them. So that process has started. What brings us here is Ethiopian Airline Flight 302, an international flight between Addis, Ethiopia to Nairobi, Kenya on March 10th, 2019. The aircraft took off at about 8:30 local time, and at about within a minute of the flight, not much more than 1,000 feet above ground level, the pilot reported a flight control problem and requested a permission to return to the airport. Because of this clear product defect in the Boeing 37 MAX 8 aircraft, unfortunately, all 157 people on board, including the crew, passed away. The 149 passengers on the board come from 35 different nationalities and countries, including 8 from the United States and 18 from Canada. The case we have brought today is against Boeing, the manufacturer of the aircraft, who was responsible for making sure that this aircraft was safe for flight. It was not. This was a brand new aircraft delivered to Ethiopian Airlines on November 15th of 2015, a 4-month-old aircraft. As this was an international flight between countries that are parties to the Montreal Convention, the rights of the parties against Ethiopian Airlines are governed by the Montreal Convention of 1999. The faulty sensor that precipitated this event was manufactured by Rosemont Aerospace. As stated, we have brought a claim against the FAA. They were responsible for ensuring to the American public and to the world that the aircraft that was going to be flying, that aircraft was safe for flight. It is pretty clear they failed in that regard. Unfortunately, the FAA delegated much of its responsibility in making sure the component part, in this case, the MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristic Augmentation System, was safe. They delegated that responsibility to the manufacturer, Boeing, who had another motive of getting this aircraft out for sale. They should not have delegated that responsibility or as much responsibility to Boeing and should have made their own independent determination that this system was safe. Any aerospace design engineer will tell you that redundancy of systems is crucial in the design of an aircraft. No single failure of a system or a part, such as what happened in this case, should cause a plane to crash and everybody to perish. I'm going to hand this over to Frank now, who's going to talk a little bit more about what happened and the history of this aircraft.
Thank you. We have the PowerPoint up there.
No, turn the lights, please. Just the one to the right.
Let's see, we have the PowerPoint. We'll proceed. There's some basic fundamentals to making sure that a plane is safe. It starts with design and testing, and that's the responsibility of the manufacturer, and in this particular case, the supplier of the sensors, which failed here, Rosemont. Then there's FAA oversight. It depends on people who are properly trained and qualified to inspect the process that was used to have this aircraft deemed safe. Third, there's pilot training and ensuring that pilots are properly experienced and qualified to operate the aircraft even when confronted with an emergency situation. In this particular instance, all three of those layers failed, which led to the tragedy of 156 people losing their lives. And what I'd like to do is first highlight the major focus that most of the investigation has come to realize, which are really reflected, if you will, in the aerodynamics of this aircraft that are depicted in the chart that is all the way to my right. We talk a lot about a sensor. The sensor that everybody has been talking about is a sensor that helps to calculate or provide information about the angle of attack. Think of the angle of attack as a plane and the steepness of that plane as it ascends. If the plane gets too steep, the plane can stall. So the sensor collects information and it feeds that information down into the MCAS system, MCAS system. That's the system that Boeing created for the 737 MAX 8 plane. When that happens, if there's a sense that the plane's steepness has gotten too high, automatically and through the computer, there's an adjustment in the horizontal area of the tail back here, which forces the nose of the aircraft back down. That's the system, theoretically, the way it's supposed to operate. So we're talking about a flight control system, and we're talking about a sensor that gathers information. To put that back into perspective, it's the interaction of the sensor and the MCAS system that is really the problem that we are grappling with today and the tragic consequences that it caused. But to put it into perspective, you have to understand a little bit about the history of how the aircraft was designed, and that's Boeing. The first thing that one understands, and all of this is outlined in the complaint, so everything I'm telling you is in the complaint. Copies are available for those who need it. They're also in the claim form that was filed today. So you will see all of this information in the documents filed with the court today so that there can be no questions about where the information is coming from. But the history is that Boeing 10 years ago was facing competition, and it was facing competition from Airbus. There's no secret. So around 2010, Airbus was coming out with more fuel-efficient engines. Boeing saw that as a threat to their international competition for the sale of aircraft. They knew that they were behind, and they needed to get their planes out in the marketplace that could compete with Airbus quickly. Ergo, the motivation. What they decided to do is they decided that they couldn't wait the amount of time it would take to fully redesign an aircraft. So they took a shortcut. They used the existing airframe, and what they did is they decided to put larger engines and more fuel-efficient engines on that plane, except for a couple of problems. When you put larger engines on a plane that was that old in vintage, the plane was designed where the wings are very low to the ground. So when you put those larger engines on, you need more clearance. So what happens is you have to move those engines forward. You also have to move the landing gears forward. And when you change the position of the engines, you change the landing gear, you change the aerodynamics of the aircraft. Now, when that happens, you do those kinds of changes, you have to retrain pilots because the plane behaves differently. And in this case, the plane, because of the larger engines, has a tendency to thrust upward faster and more powerfully than the originally designed 737 model. Well, rather than spend the time and force air carriers to take time to train their pilots and to go through more costly training, the decision was that Boeing would come up with its own software that would help have the plane behave the same way the older 737 behaved. And they did that with the design of the MCAS system. The MCAS system is an automated system that would control the tendency of the airplane to buck upward. That when it sensed the plane and the nose of the aircraft was moving up, the automatic signals would be sent to the MCAS system and the horizontal stabilizer to push the nose down. Now, that would all be done automatically without the knowledge of the pilots. And that's critical to avoid retraining. The pilots could operate the plane the same way they operated prior iterations. The system would all take care of adjustments to the aircraft and its behavior tendencies automatically without any need to retrain pilots. On October 29th of 2018, we know there was the Lion air crash, and that's when things began to unravel. The dangers that had been concealed about the plane's tendencies and its aerodynamics now started to manifest themselves. At a meeting where some pilot union representatives were present, a Boeing executive was quoted as saying, "They didn't pass on the differences in the plane's tendencies and the operation of the MCAS system onto pilots because they didn't want to inundate them with new information." In November of 2018, as you know from the history, Boeing and the FAA issued, in our view, incomplete and ineffective airworthiness directives that failed to address the design problems and led people to believe that the problem could be cured by simply telling pilots to deactivate the system and everything would be fine. No need to worry, the plane was safe. Unfortunately, history had to repeat itself. 156 people lost their lives. Now the plane is grounded too late for Samia. What I'd like to do is to show you some recent information that we've gotten our hands on. The first of which was a document that was sent anonymously after the Lion air crash in November of 2018 by a pilot. And what the pilot did is he sent this email that you see here describing his experience and knowledge of the MCAS system to a network that was shared not only with other pilots, but also with the aviation industry. And what he said, you can read this up here, is he describes that the MCAS function becomes active when the angle of attack exceeds a threshold. He describes what happens to the horizontal stabilizer, the dangers that are created. He describes that if the angle of attack persists, that's the steepness of the plane, the flight control system and commands will push the nose down. The very experience that happened with Lion Air, the very experience that happened with the most recent crash. He tells everybody that the description of what happens and how it works was not in the 737 flight manual. So there was no way for the pilots to know about the dangers and how the plane would behave. That failure was being considered as part of the airworthiness directive. But we know that airworthiness directive that was subsequently issued was incomplete because it didn't describe the very things that were experienced by the pilot and that he put in his email. His opinion, his words, not Mr. Durkin's, not mine. I think it's unconscionable that a manufacturer, the FAA and the airlines, would have pilots flying an airplane without adequately training or even providing available resources and sufficient documentation to understand the highly complex systems that differentiate this aircraft from prior models. The fact this airplane requires such, he uses the word jury-rigging, jerry-rigging, to fly is a red flag. Now we know the systems employed are error-prone, even if the pilots aren't sure what those systems are, what redundancies are in place, and failure modes. This is November of 2018. I'm left to wonder, what else don't I know? The flight manual is inadequate and almost criminally insufficient. It's a tragedy that more people were not paying attention, and it's a tragedy that the FAA ignored what they were being told, because we wouldn't be here today. The other piece of information that came out just a couple of days ago, if we could. John? Sorry. Was a letter that was written by the chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, dated April 2nd, 2019. There's copies here if you want it. You can read it for yourself. But it had received information from whistleblowers that the FAA was known to have inspectors who were not properly trained or qualified to do their job of oversight, and that lack of training, lack of qualification, included individuals who were involved in the 737 MAX 8. In light of that information, it was left to Boeing to police itself with respect to safety concerns about the airplane. It is reported in the Senate letter that the FAA may have been notified about the deficiencies as early as August of 2018. Once again, a failure of oversight, a failure of those who are supposed to serve as watchdogs to do their job to ensure the safety of airplanes for passengers. It's these concerns that have led Kevin Durkin and myself, on behalf of our respective offices, to pursue the case that we have filed today, the claims that we have filed today on behalf of SAMIA, with the hope, as Ralph Nader said, that this never happens to anyone again. We thank you for your time. We'll open it up to questions for anybody that has questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your comments, and Boeing has issued an update to its software and has commented that it's making changes to its software. Is that sufficient in any of your minds to once again operate these aircraft?
You know, when a company like Boeing, given its history that we just saw here, says that, yeah, we've made changes, we've fixed the problem, I don't believe that. I mean, let's get the experts, independent experts, not the FAA. I mean, I must be honest, in my opinion, given what I've seen here and the information that has been revealed, can we, as the public, trust the FAA to make the proper decision to certify this aircraft? Don't we have an obligation to the public to ensure that independent experts are the ones that are reviewing the data and the supposed software fix to ensure that this plane is safe? So I must tell you that based on what I have seen, and in my opinion, given how this plane was certified to fly safety, I have serious questions about the process and Boeing's credibility, as well as the FAA, to pass on the safety of an aircraft. I would ask that the federal government get involved and appoint a blue ribbon safety committee of experts to review what has been submitted and make an independent determination of the safety of this aircraft before it is allowed to fly again.
Further on your question, just remember that Boeing and the FAA, after the Lion Air crash, even though they knew about this point of failure, told the traveling public that this aircraft was safe for flight. So can we trust them to do this? No, they need some other oversight than has happened in the past.
I guess just to follow up and speak for Sonia's family, how are you feeling? You probably had to learn far more than you ever thought about aircraft and how aircraft are certified. How are you feeling about yourselves, your loved ones, getting on planes these days?
We had to get on planes. We had to get on a plane to go and try to find Samia. And then we had to accept the Ethiopian aircraft flight back to the States. I'm not an expert. I just know we took the risk, and I think there's a huge problem here. And I don't know if we could die by taking those risks. We flew to Chicago from Massachusetts. I just think that something should be done about it. But I can't tell you what the problems are and which, obviously this plane is a problem, but I'm not an expert. I just think that we have to be more careful. And what I said about Boeing not treating people like their own family members, not thinking about what they would want for their own daughter. Maybe their daughter could be in a developing country. Maybe she could get in an accident. Maybe she would have to fly one of these planes. Is that really what that's what they're offering the rest of us?
There's a question from a gentleman over here.
Talk a little bit more about the subcontractor, Rosemont. How much they worked with Boeing in the past, their equipment on other Airbus airplanes, and so forth.
My understanding is that Rosemont designed the sensor for this particular aircraft. And just so people can put this into perspective, the sensors are the devices that collect information to help calculate through the MCAS the angle of attack. So they supplied the sensors. In terms of their history working with Boeing, I don't have any information about that. The interesting thing about this is that there were two sensors on this aircraft to collect that information about the angle of attack. However, for purposes of activating the MCAS system, remember the MCAS system is what automatically controls the horizontal stabilizer at the back of the plane that causes the nose to go up or down. The data from only one sensor was used, not two. That's unusual. Typically, you have both sensors, and if there's a conflict, the pilots are warned. In this case, only one sensor was there, and if data was inaccurately reported about the angle of attack, then the command is for the nose down. And so the supplier here, and the question that we all have, is was there a defect in the sensor and its ability to accurately report data that would be used to calculate the angle of attack? That's basically the anti-stall mechanism and how it interacted with the MCAS system. That's the focus. Was it one or the other, or both in their interaction.
Do you make any specific allegations about the reports that the warning system that saw a disagreement between the two angle of attack sensors was an optional piece of equipment from Boeing?
Thank you. That is in the complaint. Go ahead.
Repeat the question so
Yes.
people can hear them on the,
The question, sure, the question, as I heard from the audience, was, did we include information or have any information about the warning system that was used on the aircraft or not used on the aircraft, but was offered as optional equipment for other airplane purchasers or air carriers? And just to put that into perspective, the way the system typically works is that, when there's a conflict, the two sensors collect data regarding the angle of attack. A message is sent. The message that highlights the conflict then is shown up almost like the idiot light on your car. It's a red light that kind of lights on and warns the pilot there's a conflict in data, and the pilot then can take action because he's being told that you're getting different information about the angle of attack and try to then manually control the aircraft. The problem, as was very well taken and is in our complaint, is that what Boeing did is that it made that red light, the so-called idiot light, optional equipment. It's almost like you're buying a car, I want the moonroof. And, if you want to have the moonroof with your car, you pay a little extra. This is a safety device. This is an additional warning device that should never have been optional equipment on this kind of system. It should have been included as standard equipment, a safety feature, no different today than, your anti-lock braking system. Thank you for the question, sir.
You said you don't really trust Boeing and the FAA to fix this problem on their own, but I wanted to ask you to respond specifically to a statement that Boeing just put out since this press conference began. Boeing Commercial Airlines president, CEO Kevin McAllister, said, "We will carefully review the Ethiopian Accident Investigation Bureau preliminary report, and will take any and all additional steps necessary to enhance the safety of our aircraft." Goes on to say, "To ensure unintended MCAS activation will not occur again, Boeing has developed and is planning to release a software update to MCAS," etc. Could you just respond to that? That is not enough.
Well, sure. Boeing apparently has issued a statement saying they're going to do everything that's necessary to make sure that they've fixed the problem with their new software patch, and that we should be content with that statement. I'm not. My father used to say, don't watch what people say in their mouth, watch their feet, which was, he was Sicilian, so it was a shorthanded way of saying, watch their actions, not their words. If I'm going to be judging by actions and the actions of what happened both before Lion Air and after Lion Air, I take no solace, no comfort in that statement. I want an independent review panel to take a look at the work and make a decision as to whether or not this plane is safe to fly.
How come we were the last country to ground this plane afterwards? What political pressure, what pressure Boeing with the FAA took place in there? And that's part of what we're going to find out in the course of these lawsuits. But how can we then trust them to make that decision? We take them at their word, and we hope they make this as safe as possible. But someone needs to look over and make sure it's done correctly.
No matter what they say, all it comes down to is trust us. And the answer is why?
Absolutely.
what do you mean by that? Can you unpack that a little bit?
You've let us down. You've killed people when you've let us down. This whole fool me once, fool me twice. Hundreds of people die each time. You can't. There's no third crash. There can't be a third crash. And the only way to go about that is to involve independent parties, as Mr. Petrie said.
Samuel was living in Washington, D.C., but she was flying to Uganda, is that right?
She's lived a lot of places in the country. Her home has always been Massachusetts, but she was employed by a Washington NGO and was transitioning towards Washington. And she flew from Washington.
She was doing what specifically when she was on that flight?
Sure. Her new employer of about 6 weeks had assigned it's a global health organization, as you may know, interested in bottom-up change in global health. And the founder and her boss sent her to Uganda to open new offices in 6 African countries for a new project. And so that's what she was doing. It's something that usually is reserved for people 15 years her senior, but she was there 6 weeks and was assigned the task.
Question for Kevin or Frank. Your lawsuit talks about negligence, but you also, I know in the press release, talk about a knowing act and greed. Do you believe there should be criminal charges against Boeing executives? Do you think you're leading in that direction? Or is it merely negligence and maybe recklessness?
Yeah, Larry, as you know, yeah, Larry wants to know if, about possible criminal charges. I take it with, regarding the design of the aircraft. You know there's been a grand jury impaneled that's subpoenaing people, and there's witnesses coming forward. So I suppose that's going to have to take its course. Our complaint, as you know, is for civil damages, and any of that would have to be done, I suppose, through the Department of Justice if there was something. There is a history in the world, mostly in Europe, where flawed designs where companies were criminally charged. There have been cases, especially with Aerospatiale in particular, with the ATR 42 some 35 years ago, where that was done. But it's not a common thing in the United States. In fact, it's never happened. But I would leave that to the Department of Justice, and if they find evidence that shortcuts were taken intentionally for profits, then I certainly hope they would do that.
Just to kind of clarify, amplify a little bit, you can take the words of that anonymous pilot prior to Lion, that it was unconscionable for an aircraft manufacturer to release a plane knowing of the problems that it had and not alert pilots. After Lion, I don't know how one can conclude anything other than this was a conscious disregard for safety in continuing on with that aircraft without fixing the problem, and fixing the problem doesn't mean a software patch. So in my humble view, we have asserted a claim for punitive damages against Boeing for their conscious disregard of safety in the process that they did to pass off a redesigned aircraft as if it was the same as a predecessor aircraft, and not do things like include an idiot light for pilots, not to tell pilots about the behavior, not to fix the design problem and use Band-Aids as software to claim that it was safe. So we feel very strongly about that claim.
What's the amount you're seeking? I see the FAA filing says $25 million.
That's an amount that is put in because we have to fill out a form. The amount that people seek to recover is what a judge or a jury will determine is fair. And that's what we would seek.
Do you expect that this might working?
Test, 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 test.
Switch it on.
Test, 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 okay. And just to clarify, do you expect or do you expect that this action, this legal action, could become a class action?
No, this is not an airplane. People call these class actions. We've heard it said before, but it's very possible that the cases will be consolidated in front of one judge, which is completely different than a class action.
For the Stumo family, to hear all of these details, to hear about all of the correspondence and the information prior to the crash, your reaction is visible, some of you, but if you could articulate how you were feeling hearing about these, what seem to be lapses leading up to your loved one's crash.
I don't know if you're bringing it.
Yeah, I don't think we want to, it's very hard to articulate, and we don't feel like doing it publicly.
And it, obviously, this could have been prevented. And that's what makes me cry. Because all of these people, it's not just Samia. You know, one family lost their whole family, grandparents, parents, children. Another guy lost his wife and his 1-year-old child. I mean, this is just repeated 157 times. I mean, we've met so many of these families, and this could have all been prevented. And that's why when we read the statement from the pilot, that's why I'm crying, because that's just horrible. Like, it's not like it was an accident. This is not an accident. This is something that could have been prevented and should have been prevented. And the people who died in Indonesia, theirs should have been prevented, but certainly their deaths should have not been in vain, and more deaths happened. So that's why we keep talking about a third crash. That is entirely possible based on the whole situation as it exists now. And my uncle said these planes should be grounded. I don't know another way that we could be sure that this isn't going to happen a third time. And as somebody who's lost a dearest person in my life, you know, I want her death not to be in vain. I don't want anybody else to die. So that's my reaction.
Are there any other questions?
You had mentioned wanting an independent review of the safety of this particular aircraft. What about when it comes to the broader oversight process?
Well, I think that's right now being investigated by the Senate committee. We saw that letter. I believe that people are standing up and paying attention to what happened here. And, you know, thank goodness for the good reporting by the media. You've got people's attention. There are people who are whistleblowers who are coming forward. They're speaking with the legislators. I wish them all success to get to the bottom of this, because I do believe the system has to be restructured. There is a too cozy relationship between, in this case, Boeing and the FAA, where, you know, corporate executives that are too eager to get a plane out to the market can put pressure on the FAA to merely pass through their safety inspections so that, you know, companies like Boeing can achieve their profits. And I think that whole system needs to be revisited. Yes, sir.
We are constantly told that air travel We're constantly told that air travel is exceptionally safe. What's gone wrong with this particular aircraft at this particular point that would make it, that they would make the mistakes that you're alleging, I guess?
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing here is people aren't taking reports from pilots who fly these aircraft seriously. I mean, to me, they seem to be ignored. What is happening? Who's doing the evaluations here? That's step number one. Step number two, the process, at least that we've seen here, of aircraft manufacturers bypassing a thorough design review of a plane merely by saying, I've made a few changes to things, otherwise the plane operates the same way as a predecessor. That needs to be evaluated. You know, we can't use the same process. If somebody's going to come up and make any kind of design change, they got to go through a more thorough review. But these are all the issues I think that are being raised. What happened in this process? What are the lessons learned? And how do we reshape the structure of getting planes airworthy and safe to fly for the public? And that's what I hope the legislators are going to do as part of their process of investigating the FAA, doing an inquiry of how the system worked here to get this plane certified, and from those lessons that led to these calamities, improve the system or change it so that we don't have families like the Stumos having to appear at a press conference to describe what happened to get everybody's attention.
Really just a point of clarification. Mr. Nader and Mrs. Milleron suggested that perhaps this plane needs to be permanently grounded. Is that what you're seeking here? And would you be satisfied with anything less?
Well, the lawsuit unfortunately can't reach those kinds of issues. There's a regulatory process that you have to go through. Is it a personal desire of the Mr. Nader and a personal desire of the Stumo family? Absolutely. We don't have control in the civil process of grounding aircraft. The only thing we can do is seek compensation for victims as a way of standing up and getting the attention of the board of directors and those who are the profiteers at Boeing to say that if that's what you're going to do, you're going to pay a price for it. Now, ultimately, we want to work in conjunction with legislators to affect those changes. And if stories like this need to be told through the Stumo family to get legislators to pay attention, I believe what I'm hearing from the Stumo family is they're all in.
Okay,
Thank you.
is that it? Thank you very much. Thank you, Frank.
Sure.
Thank you all for coming. Still on the press conference.
Good job. That was.
Your statements are available online.
I just need the yellow.